The wind cut through Copper Creek Junction like a razor, promising a Christmas Eve that would be remembered long after the snow melted. Silas Reed pulled his collar tight. He stepped off the train, and the whistle screamed a final, lonely goodbye before the iron beast vanished into the white fury. He was 42, but grief had carved the lines of a much older man into his face. For 6 months, since he'd buried his wife Sarah and their newborn son, he'd been a ghost haunting his own life. He'd just spent 3 weeks in Denver settling the last of the medical bills, a task that had bled him dry of everything but the ranch itself. And now he was back. Back to the empty house, the unfinished cradle in his workshop, the crushing silence where Sarah's laughter used to be. He wondered why he'd bothered coming back at all. As he turned to leave the platform, a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, huddled against the depot wall, was a figure that didn't belong. A young woman, shivering on a wooden crate. Her coat was a joke against the Wyoming winter, her lips already tinged with blue. She looked up, and her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were filled with a desperation that hit him like a physical blow. She was freezing to death, right there on his platform. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the wind. "Is there somewhere warm I might wait?" Silas looked around. The depot was dark. The only other light came from Murphy's saloon, no place for a woman like her. "Stage doesn't run in weather like this," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He saw a crumpled telegram in her gloved hand. She was waiting for a ride that was never coming. "My name is Clara Whitlock," she managed, a weak smile playing on her frozen lips. The name was clean and simple, like her face. "I'm Silas Reed," he said, "and you're not a fool. Desperate, maybe. But that's different." He saw it then. It wasn't just the cold. She was running. The way she glanced over her shoulder, the way her small bag was clutched tight. This was not a simple journey. He asked her where she was headed, and she hesitated. "A business arrangement," she said, so delicately that he knew exactly what it meant. She was a mail-order bride, traveling all this way to marry a man she'd never met. But something had gone terribly wrong. The wind howled, and her shivering grew worse. In that moment, Silas made a decision that surprised even him. The part of him he thought had died, with Sarah stirred. "Come on," he said, grabbing his satchel. "There's an old chapel down the street. It's got 4 walls and a roof. We can build a fire." She looked at him with a gratitude that almost broke his heart. As they stumbled through the driving snow, Silas wondered what Sarah would have thought. "You can't save everyone, Silas," she used to tell him, "but you can save the ones put in front of you." Maybe this was one of those times. He had failed to save his wife and child. What business did he have trying to save a stranger? But as he unlocked the chapel door, he realized that for the first time in 6 months, he had a purpose beyond just breathing. They stepped inside, out of the wind. It was a sanctuary. He lit a lamp and knelt by the old pot-bellied stove. As he worked to build a fire, he could feel her eyes on him, trying to figure out if he was a savior or just another kind of threat. "You can trust me," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." "I know," she said, her voice cautious. "You have kind eyes, like my father did." The fire caught, and in the dancing orange light, he saw her properly for the first time. She was beautiful, with a quiet strength that reminded him of Sarah. They settled on the front pew, letting the warmth from the stove seep into their bones. "Tell me about Cedar Falls," he said gently. She stared into the flames for a long time before she spoke. "His name was Robert Henley," she whispered. "A widower, 2 children. We'd been corresponding for 3 months." She pulled a bundle of letters from her coat. "He seemed like a good man. Kind." She stopped, and Silas heard the unspoken words. Nothing like the man I'm running from. What happened? He asked. I received a telegram in Cheyenne. Mr. Henley died of influenza 2 weeks ago. His children are with relatives in California. Her future had been erased by a few words on a piece of paper. Is there family you can go back to? Silas asked. Her laugh was bitter. No, there's no going back. Something in her tone told him not to push. He found himself telling her about his own loss, about Sarah and the baby. It felt good to say their names aloud, to share the weight of his grief. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Clara said, her voice soft with sympathy. As the night deepened and the storm raged on, the last of her story finally came out, and Silas understood that Clara Whitlock wasn't just stranded, she was in mortal danger. The torn train ticket lay on the pew between them, a one-way passage from St. Louis to a life that no longer existed. My Uncle Bernard made the arrangements, she said, her voice a near whisper. He said a woman like me needed a husband to provide for her, but now I know what he really meant. Her jaw was tight. She was a woman pushed to the edge. Uncle Bernard was a gambling man, she continued, her eyes fixed on the fire. When my parents died, he took me in, but I was always just a burden to him, another mouth to feed. The story poured out of her then, a torrent of fear and betrayal. Last spring, her uncle's debts had become overwhelming. He owed money to dangerous men, the kind of men who don't forgive or forget. What did he do? Silas asked, his own anger beginning to simmer. He tried to use me as collateral. At first, it was just suggestions of marriage. Then he started bringing his business associates to dinner. She saw them for what they were, vultures. I refused, she said, her hands clenching. I told him I'd find work, but he said no respectable man would hire a woman with no family, no connections. He called me ungrateful. Then came the final betrayal. He showed her the contract. What contract? Silas's voice was low, dangerous. He'd made a deal with a man named Morrison, Clara said, the name tasting like poison. He runs an establishment near the riverfront. If Uncle Bernard couldn't pay his debts by Christmas, I would work for Mr. Morrison until the debt was settled. Silas knew exactly what kind of establishment Morrison ran. He'd seen them during the war, places where women's souls went to die. How much did he owe? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. $2,000. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. It was an impossible sum. She knew she could never escape it. That's when she found the advertisement from Robert Henley, a widower on the frontier. It wasn't love, but it was a lifeline. It was survival. My uncle was furious at first, she said, her voice bitter. But when he realized I'd be gone for good, he was relieved. One less problem for him. But the problems didn't just go away. The Pinkerton agents, Silas said, connecting the dots. I saw them in Cheyenne, she confirmed, her face pale. 2 men in dark suits showing my photograph. I heard one of them say my name. The storm might have slowed them down, but they're coming. Clara was trapped. Her groom was dead. Her uncle had sold her, and armed men were hunting her across the country. She had tried to get help from the law back in St. Louis. The sheriff there told her it was a family matter, that an uncle had the right to make arrangements for his dependent niece. The injustice of it made Silas's blood boil. What will you do now? He asked. For the first time, her composure broke. Tears streamed down her face. I don't know. I have $17, no references, no family. She didn't need to say the rest. A woman alone in the territory had few options. Most ended up in places just like Morrison's. Silas looked at her, this brave, broken woman, and an idea started to form. It was audacious. It was insane. It was completely contrary to every plan he'd made for his quiet, empty life. but as he looked at her tear-streaked face, it began to feel like the only sane thing left to do. You can save the ones put in front of you. Clara, he said slowly, what if there was a way to give you legal protection, something that would put you beyond your uncle's reach for good? Hope flickered in her eyes. What do you mean? He took a deep breath. Once the words were spoken, there was no taking them back. Marriage, he said simply. If you were married to someone else, your uncle would have no claim on you. A husband's rights supersede an uncle's. She stared at him, her mind racing, working through the impossible logic of his proposal. This wasn't romance. It was a shield, a legal fortress. Are you proposing to me, Mr. Reed? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I suppose I am, Miss Whitlock, he said, and then added quickly, not in a romantic sense. It would be a marriage of convenience. For your protection, you'd have my name, the legal standing that comes with it. And in return? She asked. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Company, maybe, he admitted. Someone to talk to. Someone to help me remember what it feels like to be human. She was quiet for so long he thought he'd made a terrible mistake. He was a grieving widower proposing to a fugitive he'd met 6 hours ago. Then she smiled. A real smile, the first one he'd seen. And suddenly, it wasn't insane at all. Yes, she said. Yes, Mr. Reed, I accept. At 3 in the morning, Murphy's Saloon was the only place in Copper Creek Junction that could host a wedding. The blizzard still raged, but word had spread. Thomas Henley, the telegraph operator, stood over his silent brass key. He was a former Methodist minister, and he insisted on doing things properly. 2 witnesses, minimum, he declared, adjusting his spectacles. And both parties must consent freely. Sheriff Morrison stumbled through the door, bringing a blast of snow and the smell of whiskey. He was a large man, soft in the middle, his face a road map of broken capillaries. What's all this? He slurred, his blurry eyes fixing on Clara. A wedding? Mighty sudden. His tone was laced with insinuation. Silas felt his hands clench. The lady is in need of protection, Sheriff, Silas said, his voice level. And I'm providing it. Protection from what? Morrison sneered, stepping closer to Clara. You running from something, Missy? Clara lifted her chin. Not from the law, Sheriff, but there are men who mean me harm. Morrison laughed, a nasty grating sound. Seems to me a respectable woman wouldn't have such troubles. The air grew thick with menace. Just as Silas was about to step in, a new voice cut through the tension. Sheriff, perhaps you'd care for some coffee. Mrs. Elizabeth Kowalski, the boarding house proprietor, stood in the doorway. She was a woman of 50, with steel-gray hair and an air of unshakable authority. She carried a coffee pot and a plate of sandwiches. Her presence seemed to calm the room. Young Mr. Henley fetched me as a witness, she said briskly, pouring coffee. Seemed the Christian thing to do. Morrison grumbled but took the coffee. Decent folks don't usually need emergency weddings in the middle of a blizzard, he muttered. What's going on? Said another voice. Is that 2 people deserve our support, not our suspicion. Dr. Samuel Hayward, the town doctor, stepped inside. He was the man who had tended to Sarah in her final days. His arrival surprised Silas. Doc, Silas said, nodding. Came to check on Mrs. Patterson's baby, Hayward explained. Storm caught me. Thomas sent word. Thought you might appreciate having someone here who can vouch for your character. The jab at the sheriff was clear. Dr. Hayward looked at Clara, his expression kind. Sarah was a remarkable woman, but I have a feeling she would have approved of this. You think so? Silas asked, the doctor's words mattering more than he expected. Sarah always said you had a gift for finding people who needed help, Hayward replied. Looks like that gift is still working. Henley cleared his throat. Mr. Reed, Miss Whitlock, please stand here. They took their places by the telegraph station. They were strangers, about to bind their lives together out of desperation. Do you have rings? Henley asked. Silas touched the gold band on his left hand. Sarah's ring. He couldn't take it off. Clara placed a hand on his arm. Keep it, she whispered. We just need the words. Henley nodded. Dearly beloved, he began, his hand on the telegraph key. The familiar words flowed, not spoken, but tapped out in Morse code, sent out into the storm-filled night, a strange, electric proclamation. Beside him, Clara's voice was steady as she repeated the vows. This wasn't the life he had planned. But standing there, listening to the rhythmic click of the telegraph, Silas felt a strange sense of rightness. Whatever was coming for them, they would face it together. He was a married man again. The storm was finally dying. Dawn was an hour away. In a small room at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house, Clara held a silver locket in her palm. It was my mother's, she said softly, opening it to reveal 2 tiny photographs of her parents. I always imagined wearing this on my wedding day. She didn't have to say the rest. A wedding to a man she loved, not a stranger who was her only shield. Mrs. Kowalski had insisted Clara take the room while Silas slept by the fire downstairs. It wasn't proper, married or not. Tell me about them, Silas said, sitting in a chair nearby. The story of her parents came out, a memory of a happy life in St. Louis before the typhoid fever took them both when she was 15. A life before her uncle. He was my father's brother, she said, closing the locket with a soft click. He said it was his duty to provide for me. It took me a while to understand that duty and kindness aren't the same thing. She went to the window, a small, vulnerable figure in a borrowed nightgown. He never let me forget I was a burden. Every meal, every dress, was a debt I had to repay with work and submission. Silas felt that cold anger rising in him again. Did he ever? He started, unable to form the words. Clara understood. No, he never touched me. But there are other ways to hurt someone, to make them feel worthless. She turned from the window, tears in her eyes. The worst part was, I started to believe him. When Robert Henley's letters came, part of me wondered if I even deserved that small chance at happiness. And now, Silas asked gently. She managed a shaky laugh. Now I'm married to a man I met less than a day ago, hiding from Pinkerton agents in Wyoming. I'm not sure it qualifies as happiness, but it's an improvement. They sat in the quiet, the only sound the whisper of the dying wind. What happens now? She asked. Now, Silas said, we make this work. You're Clara Reed. That gives you legal protection. Some protection, she corrected. Yes, he admitted. If your uncle has warrants, he could still make trouble. But it's harder now. And what about us? She asked. This arrangement. It was a fair question. They were married by law, but strangers in every other way. My ranch is isolated, he said. You'd have privacy, space, and I could use the help, the companionship, housework. If you're willing, but more than that, someone to talk to. Sarah and I were partners. I don't expect that, but maybe we could be friends. A real smile touched her eyes. I'd like that, she said. I've been alone for so long. There was one last thing. The physical aspects of marriage, Silas began, fumbling for the words. I don't expect. I understand, Clara said, saving him. This is a marriage of convenience, not passion. Are you comfortable with that? More than comfortable, she said. After what my uncle tried to force on me, the idea of choosing my own path, it's a gift. As the first light of Christmas morning painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in months, a cautious hope. He had a wife again. Not Sarah, never Sarah, but a woman of courage who might just teach him how to live again. And Clara Whitlock Reed had a new name, a new life, and a chance. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was real. And it was a start. But the Pinkerton agents were still out there. The fragile peace they had found could be shattered at any moment. The storm was over, but another one was gathering on the horizon. 3 days later, Silas was cleaning his father's old Colt revolver by lamplight. It was a methodical, familiar ritual. "You know how to use that, I hope," Clara said from the doorway. She had settled into the ranch with a quiet grace, filling the silent house with the scent of baking bread and the soft sound of her humming. She wore one of Sarah's old work dresses, which she had altered to fit her smaller frame. "I do," Silas said, not looking up. "My father taught me. Said a man needed to know how to protect what was his." "And what's yours now, Mr. Reed?" she asked lightly, but he heard the real question underneath. He met her eyes. "You are. This place. The life we're trying to build." He told her about the war then, about his time with the 2nd Colorado Volunteers. He told her about the first man he killed, a Confederate raider burning out farm families. "I'm not a violent man by nature, Clara," he said, his voice low. "But I will use violence to protect what matters to me." "You'd kill for me?" she asked, her voice steady. "I would." The certainty in his own voice surprised him. He cared for this woman more than he had realized. "I received a letter today," she said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "Mrs. Kowalski brought it with the mail." Silas felt his stomach clench. "From who?" "A doctor in Denver. He was treating my uncle." She unfolded the letter, her hands steady. "Uncle Bernard is dead, Silas. He died 4 days ago." The news was a shock. If her uncle was dead, was she finally free? "What does it say?" he asked. She read the letter aloud. It said Bernard Whitlock had died from a stomach ulcer, that he had expressed regret for their difficulties, and that his final words were of concern for her welfare. It seemed too neat, too clean. "Does this change things?" Silas asked. "Are you safe now?" Clara stared into the fire. "I don't know. His debts might still exist. And those Pinkerton agents, were they hired by him or by his creditors? His death doesn't necessarily cancel the contract." Fear still lingered in her eyes. "We have to assume they're still looking for me." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Then we prepare for them. This ranch is defensible. If they come, we'll be ready." Tears welled in her eyes. "How do you see such good in me when I feel so broken?" "Because broken doesn't mean worthless," he said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes the things that break us make us stronger." She didn't pull her hand away. "I keep waiting for you to decide this was all a mistake and ask me to leave." "That's not going to happen," he said, his voice filled with a conviction that came from his very soul. "We made vows, Clara. I meant every word. Even the part about forsaking all others." The question hung in the air. He thought of Sarah, of the ring he still wore. "Sarah is gone," he said quietly. "But you're here, alive and real. Forsaking all others means choosing to build something new with you, instead of living in the past." "And if we find out the danger really is over," she asked, "what happens to this marriage then?" It was a question he had asked himself. He had come to value her presence, her laughter, her quiet strength. "That would be up to you," he said honestly. "If you wanted to leave, I wouldn't stop you. I'd help you get started somewhere new. And if I wanted to stay, then you'd stay, as my wife, my partner, my friend." She studied his face, and he saw a future he hadn't dared to imagine taking shape in her eyes. "I think I'd like to stay," she said softly. "Not because I have to, but because I want to be here, with you." For the first time, Silas began to believe that their desperate bargain might become something real. But as they sat there, holding hands, the loaded revolver lay on the table between them, a silent reminder that their peace was fragile. The letter said her uncle died peacefully, but Silas had a feeling that was just another lie in a story full of them. Clara found the diary while cleaning out a wardrobe. It was Sarah's. She'd tucked it away behind her winter shawls, and Silas had forgotten all about it. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom he hadn't slept in for months, a room that was still a shrine to his late wife. "I'm sorry," Clara said, holding the small leather-bound book. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he said, though every part of him wanted to run. He couldn't bring himself to read it, to see Sarah's handwriting, to relive those last terrible days. But he had to know what she was thinking. "Would you," he began, then hesitated. "Would you read it to me? The last few entries?" Clara's expression was full of understanding. She sat on the edge of the bed where Sarah had died, and Silas sat in the chair where he had kept his long, useless vigil. Her voice was gentle as she began to read. "August 15th. The fever is worse. Dr. Hayward says we might have to choose between saving me or the baby. I told him there's no choice. Save the baby." Silas closed his eyes. She had never told him about that conversation. Clara's voice trembled slightly as she turned the page. "August 19th. I dreamed of Silas's future. I saw him old and alone, rattling around this empty house. The thought breaks my heart more than dying does." A tear slid down Clara's cheek as she read the final lines. "If I could leave him one gift, it would be permission. Permission to love again. I know he'll think moving forward means forgetting me. But love isn't a finite resource. The heart doesn't empty. It expands." The room was silent. "She knew," Silas said finally, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She was dying, and she was worried about me." He stood and went to the window, looking out at the endless snow. For months he had been consumed by anger, at God, at fate, at the world. But Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. "Is that why you married me?" he asked, turning to Clara. "Because you think I need saving from myself." She came to stand beside him. "I married you for protection," she said. "But I'm staying because I think we can save each other. From loneliness. From believing our pasts have to define our futures." She faced him, her eyes serious. "You lost the great love of your life, Silas. I never had one to begin with. Maybe we can't recreate what you had with Sarah. But maybe we can build something new. Something that honors the past while embracing what could be." He reached out and touched her cheek. "You're not what I expected when I offered you my name." "What did you expect?" "Someone temporary," he admitted. "I didn't expect to care." "And now?" "Now," he said, his voice dropping, "I find myself hoping the danger really is over, not just so you'll be safe, but so you might choose to stay." A radiant smile lit up her face. "I've already made my choice, Silas." In that room, surrounded by the memory of one love, he began to believe in the possibility of another. But their story was built on a foundation of lies they hadn't even begun to uncover. The real danger wasn't coming from Pinkerton agents. It was something far bigger and far more deadly. And it was already on its way. A few days later, 3 riders approached the ranch. But they weren't the rough-looking men Silas had been expecting. They wore badges, Deputy U.S. Marshals, and they were holding a wanted poster. "Mrs. Reed," the lead marshal, a man named Crawford, asked, "We're looking for information about Clara Whitlock." "That was my maiden name," Clara said, her voice trembling as she took the poster. She expected to see her own face, but the face staring back at her was her uncle's. The poster read, $5,000 reward for information leading to the capture of Bernard Whitlock. Wanted for railway fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. "I don't understand," she stammered. "My uncle was just a gambler." "Mrs. Reed," said the woman with them, Agent Catherine Mills from the Treasury Department. "Your uncle wasn't just any gambler. He was the front man for a criminal organization that stole over $200,000 from the federal government. It was impossible. Her uncle, who complained about the cost of her meals, was a master criminal." "That was his cover," Marshall Crawford explained. "A down-on-his-luck businessman doesn't attract federal attention." The story that unfolded on their porch was a nightmare. Her uncle's debts weren't to local loan sharks. They were to his criminal partners, the men who expected their share of the stolen money. "What does this have to do with Clara?" Silas asked, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "Mrs. Reed," Agent Mills said, her eyes sharp. "You kept your uncle's books, filed his papers. You may have seen evidence without realizing what it was. Contracts, payment schedules, names." Memories flooded Clara's mind. The late-night meetings, the hushed conversations, the locked desk drawer. And then came the final devastating blow. "Mrs. Reed," Crawford said gently, "we believe your uncle's partners had him killed. The doctor who wrote to you was bribed to falsify the cause of death. Your uncle didn't die of a stomach ulcer. He was poisoned. Murdered. He was going to talk to the authorities, so they silenced him." "And the Pinkerton agents I saw in Cheyenne," Clara whispered, a new, more terrible dread dawning. "They weren't hired by your uncle," Agent Mills confirmed. "They were hired by his partners, to find you, question you about what you knew, and then eliminate you. She wasn't fleeing from debt. She was fleeing from a ring of murderers, and she was the only witness left who could bring them down." "We want you to testify before a federal grand jury," Agent Mills said. "In exchange, you'll have full federal protection." "And if she refuses?" Silas asked. Agent Mills's expression was grim. "Then she remains a target for the rest of her life. These men won't stop hunting her." They had a week to decide, a week to prepare for a journey to Denver that could either save her life or end it. As the marshals rode away, leaving the wanted poster on the porch table, Clara stared at the smiling face of the man who had raised her, the man who had sold her, betrayed her, and whose secret life had now put a target on her back. "What do you think?" she asked Silas, her voice hollow. "I think," he said, his voice heavy, "that our peaceful winter is about to end. The killers were still out there, and now they knew exactly where to find her. The time for deciding was over." Word came from Marshall Crawford's sources in Laramie. 3 men, matching the description of Bernard Whitlock's partners, were asking questions. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to finish the job. The town of Copper Creek Junction made its stand in the abandoned chapel. It was Silas and Clara, Thomas Henley the telegrapher, Dr. Hayward, Mrs. Kowalski, a sobered-up Sheriff Morrison, and young Billy Patterson, whose shoulder was bandaged from an early skirmish. 7 of them against an unknown number of killers. "They're not just coming for me," Clara said, her voice shaking as she held a telegraph message Henley had intercepted. It was from St. Louis. "Eliminate witness. Clean up all loose ends." They're coming to kill everyone, she realized. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for the soul of their small town. They boarded the windows, positioned their rifles, and waited. Soon, 3 riders appeared on the road, moving with the slow, deliberate menace of predators. Clara recognized one of them. The Kansas man, her uncle had called him. A man who always visited after dark. "We're looking for Clara Whitlock," a man with a black beard yelled from 100 yards out. "Send her out, and nobody gets hurt." "There's only Clara Reed here," Silas yelled back. "And she's under the protection of this community." The bearded man laughed. You think a piece of paper protects her from us? I'm the sheriff here, Morrison shouted, his voice finally carrying the weight of his badge. And I don't see any warrants. You boys mind showing me some credentials? There was a brief, tense conference among the riders. Then, the final threat. Send her out, or we're coming in to get her. Silas looked at Thomas Henley and nodded. The old telegrapher grabbed the bell rope and pulled. The bronze chapel bell rang out, a clear, urgent cry for help, a declaration of war. The sound broke the standoff. The three riders spurred their horses and charged, rifles blazing. The first bullet splintered the window frame inches from Clara's head. The siege had begun. Inside the chapel, as gunfire tore through the thin wooden walls, Clara found herself no longer afraid. 6 months ago, she was a frightened girl shivering on a train platform. Now she was a wife, a friend, a member of a community that was risking everything for her. She was no longer running. She was fighting back. The gunfight raged. Noon came and went, with no sign of the federal agents Marshal Crawford had promised. Young Billy Patterson took a bullet to the shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and kept fighting. Their ammunition was running low. 17 rounds left for the rifles, Mrs. Kowalski reported, her voice grimly calm. The attackers were growing desperate too. The bearded leader, the man Clara now knew was named Morrison, the true mastermind of the fraud, tried to call for a parley, offering them a deal for safe passage. Silas answered with a rifle shot. Just then, a sound cut through the chaos. A long, mournful train whistle. "The federal train!" Clara cried, seeing black smoke cresting the ridge. Hope surged through the chapel. Seeing the approaching train, Morrison knew the game was up. "If I can't have the woman," he screamed, his voice raw with fury, "then nobody can." He and his men launched a final, suicidal charge. They abandoned cover, running straight for the chapel, firing wildly. Silas took careful aim, his military training kicking in. His first shot dropped one man. Sheriff Morrison's rifle took down the second. That left only Morrison himself. He kicked open the chapel door, his rifle ready. But Clara was waiting. She wasn't helpless anymore. Dr. Hayward's pistol was steady in her hands. "Hello, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I believe you've been looking for me." He froze, staring at the woman who had transformed from prey into predator. Behind him, the sound of running boots announced the arrival of the marshals. "Clara Whitlock," he said with grudging respect. "Clara Reed," she corrected him. "And the chase is over." Justice had arrived in Copper Creek Junction. The chapel was cleaned, the bullet holes patched. Wildflowers from Mrs. Kowalski's greenhouse decorated the altar. The whole town gathered for a second wedding. A real one. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, had forged 2 simple gold bands from the recovered federal money. Poetic justice. Marshal Crawford offered Clara a new identity, a new life anywhere in the country. She looked at the faces in the pews. Thomas Henley, Dr. Hayward, Sheriff Morrison, all the people who had become her family. "This is where I belong," she said. "This is home." The vows they spoke this time were not of necessity, but of choice. "With this ring," Silas said, sliding the warm gold onto her finger, "I thee wed, not from duty, but from choice and love." "With this ring," Clara answered, her voice clear and strong, "I thee wed, in freedom and in trust, for as long as we both shall live." The kiss was gentle, filled with the promise of a future they had earned. Spring arrived, melting the last of the snow. The federal reward money had allowed them to rebuild the ranch, bigger and better than before. In the nursery, Silas put the finishing touches on the cradle he had started so long ago. He had added new carvings, a train, a chapel bell, a telegraph key. and for Clara he carved a tiny silver locket. She stood in the doorway, her hand resting on her belly, where their child grew. "It's beautiful," she said. They were no longer just survivors, they were builders. A letter had come from Marshal Crawford. Morrison and his partners were sentenced to 20 years. The case was closed. And there was something else. The government was starting a new program to help women caught in dangerous situations, women like she had been. They wanted Clara to serve as an advisor, to use her experience to help others find their own way to freedom. "I'd like that," she said, her eyes shining, "to help other women find what I found here." "And what's that?" Silas asked, his arms around her. "Home," she said. "Family, the freedom to choose." That evening, she placed her mother's silver locket in the hand-carved cradle. It was a promise to their child of a life built on courage, a life sustained by a love that had bloomed in the heart of a winter storm. They had found each other in the darkness, and together they had built a future full of light. If this story reminds you that even in the darkest storms, there's always a reason to hope, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. We've got another story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching.